Okay, thank you. So it's 40 years since the start of the miners' strike, and I'll talk a bit about the strike and lesbians and gays support the miners, LGSM, and I'll talk a bit about more general issues about how the struggle for socialism connects with the struggle for queer liberation, trans liberation. And I assume people have seen the film Pride, and I don't need to go through the basics of that. People know what happened. Um, Pride is very much, if you like, a feel-good Britcom. Um, it was on BBC One on Boxing Day a few years ago, and they introduced it by saying, "And now here's a real feel-good film for Boxing Day night on BBC One." And you think, this is like a film about a bunch of queer people fighting the Tories, and here it is on BBC One as a feel-good film, and that's interesting in itself. I think there's a couple of things to say. Is that it is very much a slightly softened up um, version of what happened, with the politics toned down. I think that nobody in LGSM, and I know some of those people, object to that because it gets the message out there. But it isn't quite what happened, and it's important to shift that a bit. LGSM was a group of a few dozen people. Their main activity was small numbers of them doing collections outside of queer pubs. So all very unglamorous. The miners got no benefits. The union funds had been frozen during the strike, so they didn't get strike pay. So they needed this money to live on. Um, and LGSM people had debates with people. Some people gave them money. Some people wouldn't give them money. Some because they were right wingers, but others because they'd actually come from pit villages as queer people and had a dreadful time there because the pit villages were quite isolated. They could be quite backward. There was a lot of homophobia there. And people would say, "I'm not giving any money to those bastards who beat me up when I was 14, and there was that, so there was that to it. The miners' union was very strong, but the union was, to be honest, lousy on gender politics. There were pictures of half-naked women, what we used to call page 3, in the union paper, and so on. So these people didn't know what response they were going to get from the miners. They still wanted to do this as a point of principle, but they didn't know they were going to get the very positive response that they got. The other thing that's different from the film is that in the film, I think a lot of the LGSM people are portrayed as like being fairly naive and politically unsophisticated. That's really not the case with the core members of the organization. Mark Ashton, who was one of the key activists, was a leading member of the Young Communist League, which was the youth organization of the Communist Party. Ray Goodspeed, who is a mate of mine, had been in militant for many years. They didn't just ring up a pit at random and hope for the best. They had contacts there through the CP and so on. And I think the thing there is that they were lefty activists doing what lefty activists do and doing what we do in RS21 around pay strikes or trans people or Palestine. And it is, as I say, unglamorous. And, if someone told you that a West End musical was to be made out of this meeting, you would be surprised. But that's what's happening to lesbians and gays support the miners. So, the kind of stuff that we actually do, unglamorous as it is, actually can change the world. Because LGSM did actually make a difference to trade union politics, to Labour Party politics. The miners' union shifted to much better positions after the strike. They had huge credibility because of the strike, and they brought other unions with them, and they pushed the Labour Party for the first time to take a firm pro-gay position. And I think that was the first of the Westminster parties that had done that, and that over the course of time led to the Equality Act in 2010. Back at the time of the miners' strike, queer people, we didn't really have any rights at all in terms of employment or in terms of services or housing or anything like that. And LGSM made a real difference. I mean, there were lots of other people who had been working away for years in unions, some of them on the Labour left and so on, but still they made a real difference. And I think it's important to put that into a kind of bigger historical picture, the longer history of the left and of queer people and trans people, because what they were doing was really quite new. Because if you look back to the 1960s, there was a huge level of worker militancy. For example, I spoke a few years ago to a long-standing left activist, Colin Barker in Manchester, who since died, was a founding member of RS21, and he'd been active in Manchester in the 60s, and he remembered very militant strikes in the 60s and 70s. So he remembered a strike at an engineering factory called Roberts Arundel. There was a mass picket. Before the mass picket happened, all of these engineering workers, each of them from a bit of waste ground nearby, grabbed a half brick, put it in their pockets, and at the appropriate moment, they threw these half bricks through the windows of the factory. So a very militant strike. But at the same time, they were all of them men, they were all of them white, and none of them identified as gay or, publicly came out as gay. So it's very militant, but the trade union movement doesn't really have struggles around oppression on its agenda. On the other hand, you have a gay movement in the sort of mid-60s, which is very respectable, where most of the people aren't even openly gay. They're like asking that the authorities would be, nice to these poor, sad people. And so on. So these two things are in different worlds, the left and queer people. And then comes the Stonewall Rebellion of June 1969, which again, I assume people have heard something about, but just briefly, the Stonewall was a bar in New York. It was raided by the cops. It was a gay bar, was raided by the cops. You ended up with 2,000 queer people in the street fighting 400 cops on 2 nights. Wasn't the first time that queer people had fought back. There was a riot in San Francisco at a place called Compton's Cafeteria in 1966 when trans women or drag queens, depending on what term I'm not quite sure is most appropriate, but they fought back against the cops when they were harassed. What is striking about Stonewall, and that people often quite rightly stress now, is the involvement of, it wasn't respectable people at Stonewall. If you were respectable, if you could hold down any kind of regular job, you wouldn't go into a queer bar because there was the chance of being caught in a raid, and then your picture would be in the paper and you'd be sacked and so on. So the people who were there were street people, were sex workers, were people of color, and so on. And the role of individuals like Sylvia Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, Stormé DeLavery, these people now are quite rightly praised, but there is a link between Stonewall and the struggle against racism at a different level, which is that all through the 60s, you had rebellions in American cities by African Americans over issues like employment, police harassment, housing, and so on. You had over 150 rebellions in the summer of 1967. In Detroit, 10,000 people were involved. There was an enormous number in 1968 after Martin Luther King was killed. So the rebellion in Stonewall, at the Stonewall Bar, is part of queer history, but it also has these links to Black history. And of course, it wasn't just queer people and African Americans at this time. The women's liberation movement starts from around 1968. There was a huge movement against the American war in Vietnam and so on. There was a general radicalization going on in America. And when gay liberation came to Britain in 1971, it was part of that here too, the movement around Vietnam and women's liberation, but also here an explosion of trade union militancy and the miners' strike that brought down the Tory government in 1974. And of course, part of what is motivating Thatcher in the miners' strike in 84 to 5 is getting revenge for that, because the miners had brought down a Tory government 10 years before. So all of these different struggles, you see, when they're at their most vibrant, they all link up. You know, they're all connected. And the fact that oppressions overlap and struggles overlap, people often now use the word intersectionality to talk about that. And I think that there are real strengths to that, because it rejects any attempt to just see the struggles in isolation. Because what happens quite often when you just see struggles in isolation is that you end up just thinking, is that those struggles end up being co-opted by their most middle class bits. You know, so you think about, you know, the kind of style of feminism you'd associate with Hillary Clinton, which doesn't involve changing society at all, except that women bosses will be equal to men bosses. Or you think about, you know, or you think about the states where now a lot of the police chiefs are black, but that doesn't actually benefit ordinary black people when you look at the kind of police violence which sparked Black Lives Matter. So intersectionality is good to say that all the struggles are connected, but you need to think, I think, about how they are connected. And I think that this is the great strength of the kind of Marxist analysis that we'd put forward in RS21, that we need to look at the role of capitalism and the role of the state. And we need to start from the position of the working class, that working class people are central to the way that the system works, because if we don't go out to work, then everything stops. And, you know, nothing gets made, kids don't get taught, things don't get manufactured, and so on. I should say as well here, just because there can be some confusion about what you mean by working class. I mean people who go out to work, who don't have management as a central part of their job. I mean, so when I say working class, I mean the role that people play in society, in the economy. I'm not talking about some kind of cultural definition, whether you have a regional accent, whether you like classical music, whether you watch Love Island, and so on and so forth. You know, so workers aren't just some kind of stereotype about miners and car plants and so on, but also include teachers and nurses and white collar workers and so on. So capitalism depends on having enough workers, able and ready to go out to work on a Monday morning, that we're healthy enough, we're educated enough, we're socialized into it, we get up when the alarm clock goes, and so on. And they can't assume that's the case. They have to think about how to make that happen. And this process of making sure that there are enough workers ready and willing to work is something that we refer to as social reproduction, the social reproduction of the working class, that people are biologically reproduced, babies are born and raised, but also socialized into society. And the body that does this in capitalist society is the state. Individual capitalists are just interested, individual companies are just interested about making a short-term profit. And by the state, I mean that system of judges and cops and civil servants and local government and prisons and so on. And so they want to lay down how social reproduction happens. Most of it happens in the family, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But because they're concerned about reproduction and raising kids in the family and so on, states lay down rules about who can have sex, who can marry, what public behavior is acceptable, who gets to be a citizen, who gets to be regarded as a man or a woman, or how many genders are we going to have, and so on. So that is like one aspect of it. I also, before, and I'll talk a bit more about how this connects with queer and trans struggles, but I also want to say, before I do that, a bit more about race, because you've got all of these states and they are competing with each other, and there is a hierarchy with the most powerful at the top. And this very broadly is what we mean by imperialism. And now that states are providing their citizens with services like health or education so that social reproduction can happen, the question of who is a citizen of which state becomes a big deal. You know, are you going to get the social benefits, the welfare payment, the education, the healthcare, and so on? And so who is a citizen of where becomes a big deal. And you get, only in the last 100 years do you get a borders regime develops that tracks how people move from one state to another. This is fairly recent. There weren't passports until the First World War. It only happens then. So you've got these two ways now of social reproduction. Firstly, and what the British state has done since World War II, is immigration. You bring people in because there aren't enough workers being born and raised within Britain, but most workers come from within the family. So the family is key to social reproduction, key to capitalism, and this affects the attitude which the state has to queer people, to the gender binary, because women, of course, are thought of as caregivers. It affects attitude to trans people, because the idea that people might choose their own gender or might determine their own gender, that they might, rather than thinking about, am I going to do social reproduction in a disciplined kind of way, that they might just be dictated by their own happiness, is a very worrying thought for the ruling class. So I think that's the bigger picture. I mean, just to finish off then, where are we now? Having talked about, where we were in the 60s and then with the miners' strike in the 80s, I think where we're at now is that in the 50s and 60s, there was a very clear gender binary where men, or the aspiration at least, was that men went out to work and women stayed at home and raised the kids. That has gone, partly as a result of neoliberalism. Both members of a straight couple would now have to work. The pill has decoupled sex from reproduction for straight people. The shame associated with divorce has gone. Now a major transformation is that people have a number of long-term relationships during their lives, which when I was growing up was not at all as accepted. People would talk about somebody being a child from a broken home. There was a huge shame to that. Now you've got to the stage actually where most kids are born outside of marriage. So there's been, and there are more straight couples not having kids. So there's been this huge transformation in the way that heterosexuality is lived out in people's lives. And the differences between queer and straight people, which were very big, the actual material differences back in the 50s and 60s are now a lot less. So I think that the material roots of homophobia, to put it like that, have been undermined. On the other hand, social reproduction is still vital and the family is still vital. So you have this tension between some things staying the same and some things changing. And I think at the moment it's increasingly polarized because, for one reason, there is a crisis of social reproduction, that some people choose not to have kids, but lots more aren't able to. They can't get secure housing. People in their 20s can't even move out of their parents' place. And at the same time, you have the right stoking concerns about immigration, even though migration has been central to British social reproduction since World War II. And, you know, if you look at who actually does care jobs and so on, I mean, certainly in London, and I think quite a lot of England, I'm not, you know, tell me if it's different in Scotland, but that lots of care work is actually done by immigrants. My boss's wife is seriously ill, has motor neuron disease, is you know, cannot speak or eat. She's cared for by a team of nurses, all of whom are migrants from Africa, from Zimbabwe and Nigeria. You know, because they can't, you know, because they can't get English people to do, you know, to do that work. So there is this kind of contradiction, and I don't think it's an accident that at the same time as you're getting these attacks on migrants from the right, you're also getting attacks on trans people and increasingly on queer people more generally, and the right wing fretting about how many babies people are having. And specifically, I think this is about how many white babies people are having, because it's about wanting to get back to the 1950s family. But that's not going to happen. You know, they have no way of making it happen because they're not going to pay, you know, they aren't going to pay man a family wage, enough money to raise a family. You know, it's not going to happen. The solution that most people want is better pay, is better health services, you know, rather than going back to the 1950s. And I guess the final thing to say is that so that on the one hand we have all the attacks on queer and trans people that we have at the moment, and you know, times can be grim, and I think the attacks on trans people, I mean, just in their relentlessness over a period of years, are absolutely disgusting. But I think at the same time there is now, and this is partly the reason why Pride, the film, has the resonance that it does. I think that there is also a very widespread, you know, it's not perfect by any means, but compared with how things were, there's a very widespread acceptance of queer and trans people. And I think you've got a situation in which you can argue, you know, as the trade unionist slogan has it, that an injury to one is an injury to all, that we can't let workers be divided along the lines of gender and race and sexuality and cis versus trans and so on, that we have to stand up to the scapegoating. And I think that those are arguments, you know, that we can win, because I think when, you know, the thing that, you know, the thing that everybody says when they watch Pride, if you remember the scene, you know, in the Miners Club where they sing, you know, where they sing Bread and Roses, I think that is a thing that people can relate to. I think that is a kind of world that people want to live in. So, you know, so I think that, you know, that's the world that we need to go and fight for, and that we can win. And I'll leave it there. We'll have a discussion.